Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Riga Conference Future Leaders Forum. I welcome you all to the discussion on sustainability of democracy. My name is Kristaps Celmiņš, and I am currently an active member of and project manager of the Latvian Transatlantic Organization. I would like to briefly introduce today's topic. For decades, European Union has served as an example for the rest of the world on sustainable democracy. And at the same time, democracy has been challenged by several events and processes. Rise of populism, Brexit, erosion of democratic values in Hungary and Poland, and the spread of COVID-19 have led to several unpopular decisions, which in turn have led towards questioning the balance between security and democracy. And today there are three speakers are joining us to take on the topic and tackle the discussion. And we have Amy Slipowitz, Research Manager for Freedom in the World at the Freedom House. And she will speak about the pandemic's largely negative impact on democracy and human rights. The next speaker of today's discussion will be Leah Perokrests. She is Deputy Director of Operations concerning Europe and Middle East and North Africa in the Region of Institute for Economics and Peace, IYP. She will touch upon some trends regarding how democracies perform in the Global Peace Index, and as well as how governments can increase their resilience through systemic approaches. And last but not least, we are joined by Ivars, a member of European Parliament and long-time expert and researcher concerning such topics as democracy, sustainability, sustainable policy, and its development. And he will comment on COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on the democracy itself. Each speaker will speak for 5 to 7 minutes. And then we will briefly discuss the topic with the speakers. And in the meantime, participants, please send in your questions, as after the speaker's discussion, we will address your questions. And I would kindly ask you to address the questions to a specific speaker. But if the question is meant for all the speakers, then of course send it in. And to begin, let's go with Ms. Slipowitz. I would like to give the floor to you for your opening statement.
Thank you. And thank you so much to the Riga conference for inviting me to participate in this discussion. So at the outset, I just want to state that democracy and human rights ultimately do bolster security. I think too often we see democracy and security labeled as opposites, but really that juxtaposition is a fallacy. So ultimately, protecting democracy and human rights is how you can protect security. Last month, Freedom House launched a special report called Democracy Under Lockdown, and this examines how democracy worldwide has been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think it also speaks to consequences for security as well. Ultimately, what we found was that democracy is under threat around the world. Now, threats to democracy are not new, but the pandemic has really exacerbated them. So since the COVID-19 outbreak began earlier this year, we found that the condition of democracy and human rights has grown worse in at least 80 countries. And this deterioration is particularly acute in struggling democracies and highly repressive states. One major concern at the outset of the pandemic was that the health crisis would become quite similar to what happened after 9/11. So after 9/11, laws were hastily passed and they remain in place today. These have really led to conditions that have weakened democracy and human rights, including through practices like enhanced surveillance and violations of due process. The pandemic is a very different crisis, of course, but it similarly appears that restrictions enacted in response to the pandemic could persist long after COVID-19 has subsided. So 64% of the experts that we surveyed for this report stated that democracy and human rights in their country of focus would be mostly negative over the next 3 to 5 years. So the pandemic isn't just a crisis for democracy now, we can expect the effects to last into the future, and this can continue to undermine security. I'll also go through a few of our other key findings, which were based on a survey of around 400 democracy and human rights experts, as well as additional research into 192 countries. First, clear and transparent information about COVID-19 is failing to reach the public. Lack of transparency in COVID information was a top concern. So in fact, 62% of survey respondents said they distrust pandemic-related information from the government in their country. This, of course, can have serious consequences for people's health and ultimately for their lives. Independent media really would be essential in providing an alternative to distrustful government information, but unfortunately, the media is also being stifled under the pandemic. Nearly half of the 192 countries that we assessed experienced restrictions on the news media as part of the response to the outbreak. So this includes practices like subjecting journalists to arrests, violence, and intimidation. Governments have exerted control over what kind of content can be disseminated. They've limited access to press conferences. They've passed dubious fake news legislation and have practiced various forms of online censorship. Another area where democracy has been weakened by the pandemic comes from government abuse of power. So this has ranged from security forces committing violence against civilians to enforce lockdown measures, as well as arbitrarily detaining people for violating lockdowns. At the same time, country leaders have also exploited their emergency powers to interfere in the justice system, to crack down on political opponents, and to weaken legislative functions. I think it's also important to point out that marginalized communities are experiencing much of this abuse. Around the world, they've faced discriminatory lockdown measures, disproportionate sanctions, and really widespread scapegoating. At the same time, the international community's focus on the health crisis has allowed both state and non-state actors to carry out severe human rights violations with very little scrutiny. We know that human rights violations can be a root cause of political violence. These violations push people towards living under conditions where they have limited avenues. They're not able to participate in the democratic process, or they may be living in a sort of pseudo-democratic process where their voices just cannot be heard. So the consequences of the pandemic response are undermining both democracy and security, which of course should not be viewed as mutually exclusive. As the second wave begins, governments should be able to put in place certain restrictions in order to respond to the health crisis. It's reasonable, for example, to place restrictions on movement or public gatherings. But what is essential is that these emergency measures follow certain principles. They should be proportionate and necessary. They should only last as long as the crisis persists, be well-grounded in law, and of course should be non-discriminatory. Emergency measures should also be enacted transparently and give the opportunity for individuals to seek remedies and compensation for any unnecessary or disproportionate rights violations that may have been committed during the crisis. At the same time, democratic countries, including EU countries, as well as civil society, should not hesitate to identify and then condemn human rights abuses and hold perpetrators accountable. So I'll just close by emphasizing that democracy and security go hand in hand. Having a genuine democracy in which everyone's political rights and civil liberties are respected is what will ultimately ensure long-term and effective national security. And it will also help to ensure sustainable solutions to crises like the pandemic and any future emergencies that may emerge in future years.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Lipowitz, for the interesting insight on the Freedom House report. It is important to understand that, yes, we are taking a big hit from the COVID pandemic, but also it brings out and shows us the weaknesses of ourselves, and it can help us to work on that. And that's what this report is doing. It's showing us this the problems that we should look upon. But yes, Ms. Pericrest, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this introduction, and also thank you to the hosts of today's events, and of course to my fellow panelists. I think my presentation is going to fit perfectly with what Amy has just said. So to begin, I'm going to introduce a little bit about the Institute for Economics and Peace. So it's a nonprofit think tank that's based in Sydney, Australia, and we have regional offices around the world in New York City, Mexico City, in Harare in Zimbabwe, in The Hague, and in Brussels, where I myself am located. So through our research, what we attempt to do is to analyze peace and also to look at its economic value. We have a number of annual reports that we publish every year, which include the Global Peace Index, the Global Terrorism Index, as well as the Ecological Threat Register. So today I'm going to discuss a bit about the Global Peace Index, and particularly a microcosm of what we did last year in our 2020 index was look at the types of governance and how they perform compared to one another based on the indicators that we have. So the Global Peace Index overall ranks 156 countries on their levels of relative peace. So the index takes into account thousands of different data sets when we are creating them, and we look at 23 indicators in particular. These 23 indicators can be split across 3 different domains. The first domain is ongoing conflict, and this includes both domestic and international elements. So this is things like the number and the duration of internal conflicts that may be going on in a country, the number of deaths from internal conflict, the duration and the role in external conflicts, as well as relationships with neighboring countries. The second domain includes safety and security. So this is things like, what are the incarceration rates look like in this country? What's the impact of terrorism? What are the perceived levels of criminality? That's one of our few more qualitative based indicators, as well as number of internally displaced persons is included there. And the last domain has to do with militarization. So this looks at military expenditure as a percentage of GDP, access to small weapons, or small arms within a country, weapons exports, and then one positive indicator that we have here is how much each country contributes to peacekeeping missions. So as I mentioned before, in our 2020 index, we looked closely at how different forms of governance performed on the index between the year 2008 and 2020. So for this, we use the Economist Intelligence Unit's classifications for governments, which are categorized into 4 broad types. So we have authoritarian regimes, hybrid regimes, full democracies, and what they called flawed democracies. So when we look at how they've done from 2008 to 2020, we see that countries that are classified as authoritarian regimes saw peacefulness deteriorate the most. I don't think that this will be a huge surprise for anyone in the audience. However, we've also seen that there have been deteriorations in peacefulness amongst hybrid regimes, which are kind of a mix between some democratic and some authoritarian tendencies. Amongst countries that were flawed democracies, they had an average increase in peacefulness over this period, while full democracies actually saw a small deterioration in peacefulness from 2008 to 2020. This small deterioration in peacefulness we saw started about 5 years ago. And this is a reflection of growing political instability and social unrest across Western Europe and North America as well. So if we look at these different kinds of democracies across those 3 domains that I listed before, so again, that was ongoing conflict, militarization, and safety and security, we saw that the biggest difference between these 4 different classifications had to be the ongoing conflict domain. This is because the vast majority of active armed conflict over the past about decade have taken place in authoritarian regimes. In addition, all four types of governance deteriorated on the safety and security domain, with flawed democracies deteriorating the least. Lastly, all forms of governance improved on their scores related to militarization. So that means that overall, there was a global decrease in levels of militarization since 2008. So after almost a decade of publishing these indexes, looking at this fascinating information about how different countries are performing over a long period of time, we asked ourselves, so what? How can we use these thousands of data points in a transformative way? How can we help governments and communities contribute to having more peaceful societies? And so what we ended up doing was we took all of our data from over a decade of reporting and essentially put it through a strainer. And we looked at which elements impact peace the most. And what we came up with is our positive peace model. And I think that this ties really well into what Amy was discussing in her piece as well. So I do have to mention that the Institute for Economics and Peace is an apolitical organization. So that being said, I cannot point to any one government or type of government that's withholding these values the most. But that being said, I invite you to think about this while I'm talking to see which kinds of governments would line up the best. So the positive peace model that we created is a systemic approach to socioeconomic development and peace. It shows that when a country or a community, regardless of its political nature, invests in 8 specific sectors, it will become more peaceful. The 8 specific pillars of peace are well-functioning government, equitable distribution of resources, free flow of information, like Amy was discussing regarding COVID, good relations with neighbors, high levels of human capital, acceptance of the rights of others, low levels of corruption, and a sound business environment. When these 8 areas are invested in, we see that countries are more peaceful, they perform better economically, and they are more resilient to shocks, such as political shocks, environmental, climate change shocks, or things like COVID. So these 8 pillars serve as a roadmap for communities and governments to increase peacefulness, resilience, economic standings, and are therefore more secure. So that will wrap up my speech for today, and thank you so much. And I look forward to hearing your questions on and impact on this. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Berkrest. These are some important and interesting findings on, especially in my opinion, the difference between democratic countries. And as I see, I believe we have already a few questions from the audience, and we will address them later. Now I will give the words to our last speaker, Mr. Ijabs, please.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for organizing this whole event, even despite, well, we just can't come together. And thank you to both of my fellow panelists, because I really enjoyed your presentations, and I think that, well, both reports, both about the peace and about the democracy in times of COVID, tell something extremely important for where we are today, even despite the fact that, well, the crisis has just begun basically right now. When I would completely agree with what Amy Slipowitz was saying at the very beginning, that this dichotomy between democracy and security is a false dichotomy, because, well, but nevertheless, there is a strong tendency both by decision makers and by the general population to see it as a mutually contradictory things. And that's why basically this idea of having an emergency situation is extremely dangerous, especially if we look back into history, where most of the well, European dictatorial and totalitarian regimes have been established mainly by referring to some kind of an existential threat that has to be prevented, starting with Hitler coming to power, about talking about the communist threat, which is going to take over the German Reich, up until, well, whatever. Look at what's happening right now in some of the European countries. So, and in that sense, of course, this very idea of having an emergency, an exceptional politics, as different from the normal style of politics, is we have to be always extremely cautious, and all the measures in exceptional politics have to be taken with a certain time limit and with a certain legal preconditions. This is one of the main lessons we have learned during the last months. Look at what's happening in Hungary, for example, today, when I think, or yesterday, when Orban pronounced the idea that basically, well, we are having a state of exception once again, and that's why the Fidesz government is going to use this particular period just to limit the rights of the opposition by changing its electoral legislation, which is just used, well, this is, you know, this is exceptional. We have to do something. And from that perspective, of course, but nevertheless, COVID itself, of course, is existential. It's existential in a sense that, well, this is really not just some kind of a imagined threat, but it is, on the contrary, it's very real threat to our physical existence. And in that perspective, of course, well, we should deal with it like that. If we look in what's happened in European countries during this last half a year, by the European countries, I am not meaning just the EU, but Europe as a continent, what we see is there are two tendencies. On the one hand, of course, there is this tendency what Ms. Slipovitz was talking about, different kinds of, well, suppression of civil rights, dubious fake news legislation, limitations on civil rights to protest, and so on and so forth, government abuse of power sometimes, without any doubt. At the same time, what shows that this is an exceptional crisis is that what we have also seen, and this is, by the way, what is also reported in the Freedom House report, we are seeing an increasing wave of activism and protest. If I'm not mistaken, there was something like 60% of all the countries surveyed have experienced waves of public protest. And this should be taken seriously, because this is about the reformulation of relation between state and society, because in such a existential situation, people look at their government and, well, they start to perceive that government is really necessary. What we need is really an accountable, a democratically elected, and an efficient government in order to help us to prevent further deterioration of the situation. And in that sense, I would say that this is still undecided. On the one hand, of course, well, the democracy itself is in a worse shape than it used to be, let's say, a year ago, I think in most of the continents. But nevertheless, at the same time, this is not just the one-way street that all the democracies are deteriorating. I think that we should look at our neighboring country, namely Belarus, which should also be well looked upon from the perspective of COVID crisis, because, well, what was happening there in August and what is still happening there, this is, well, the point where the society just wants to see a democratically accountable political power. And obviously that Lukashenko just can't fulfill this function and just can't respond adequately to this newly perceived need. And of course, my last point would be, of course, well, if we look at separate countries, this is important, analyzing them one by one. But at the same time, what we should also take into account is this, as Ivan Krastev, the Bulgarian political scientist, says, this kind of a democratic zeitgeist. What's happening with that? On the one hand, of course, now, well, being liberal Democrats, we are extremely happy about the outcome of the US-American election, presidential election, I mean. This is fine, but at the same time, of course, well, we have been seeing an increasing popularity in many countries of different kinds of authoritarian, xenophobic, homophobic, and so on and so forth, tendencies that are still there. And from that perspective, of course, well, very much depends on this international setup of how much do we invest in making democracy work in all countries. And this is what is probably also a problem for the democratic development right now, because during the crisis, the states usually are dealing with themselves because they are having a lot of problems with themselves, with health systems, with emergencies, with social support, and so on and so forth, which means that they have very often lost the interest in what's going on in other countries. Look at what's happening, by the way, in Armenia right now. Well, Armenia is probably, one of the most democratic countries, apart from the Baltic states, in the former Soviet Union right now, with Pashinyan being elected as a, well, democratic, pro-Western, and so on and so forth, Prime Minister of Armenia. Well, his power is deteriorating, also mostly because not because of COVID, but because of the war with Azerbaijan, and so on and so forth. And the West, including the EU, doesn't care much. Because we are dealing with our own problems, not getting involved in Armenian issues. And the same applies also to my place of work, which is the European Parliament, which nevertheless has succeeded in, the European Parliament has succeeded in making this requirements of rule of law and the particular rule of law procedure as a part of the legislation, how the next multi-annual budgetary framework and this big recovery package is going to be distributed. So the deal is not over because the Hungarians and Poles are still very much opposed to it for obvious reasons. But nevertheless, this is our task in the European Parliament to make, an efficient rule of law mechanism which would promote democracy and human rights, at least in our 27 member states. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Ijabs, for the statement. We really should look upon COVID pandemic as a drawback and opportunity at the same time. But to begin the next part of this panel, I would like to address a question of my own. Which is concerning the current events. And the question is, what is the US election impact on sustainability of democracy? Thank you. And let's start with Mrs. Slipowitz.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's really important for democratic countries to be as Ivars said, to be investing in democracy around the world. And one of the ways they can also do this is kind of by example, so strengthening their democracy at home. I think in the US, under the Trump administration, there have been some problematic actions in pandemic response. COVID-19 has kind of undermined US democracy as the Trump administration has created serious misinformation around the pandemic and sought to silence health professionals who opposed the president's claims. So I think that's quite concerning. And at home, I think there needs to be a step away from that and towards more factual information, appealing to scientific experts for what to do. And hopefully we'll see some changes in that.
Yes, thank you. Ms. Pericrest, do you want to comment?
I will comment. I do have to mention that, as I said before, we are an apolitical organization. So my answer is not going to be on behalf of the Institute for Economics and Peace, but speaking myself as an American citizen as well. I agree with a lot of what Amy has said. I think that what we've seen over the past 4 years and also during this election period has really proven a shift in the positive piece that's happened in the United States. I think we've seen a deterioration in the free flow of information in a lot of things. I think we have increasing polarization, which is also something that will need to be addressed in the United States before it turns into something even more detrimental. I also think that through this window of polarization, we have this increasing amount of things that are acceptable to say in public. And I think Trump has also driven a lot of this with what he has deemed as acceptable to say in a leadership position. So in that way, I think there's been a deterioration in the acceptance of rights of others across the United States. And lastly, when we're talking about this positive peace model, we have good relations with neighbors. I think unpredictability is causing more friction when we're talking about international partnerships, when we're talking about the involvement in international institutions. Those are key pieces of maintaining international peace. So I'm hoping that with the recent elections, we'll be able to repair some of these relations with international institutions, and that will be a step forward. Thank you.
Thank you. And let's go to Mr. Ijabs. Would you like to comment?
The same question. Well,
yes.
I would say that, of course, the promotion of democracy, of liberal democracy in the world hasn't been among the priorities of the Trump administration. I mean, you can clearly see that. If I'm not mistaken, his first visit abroad was to Saudi Arabia, which probably isn't among the most democratic countries in the world. And he has different kinds of, cozy relations with populist dictators everywhere. So in that sense, I mean, this is obvious. But at the same time, to my mind, what we need, not just, in the US, but everywhere, is a strong, democratic, and successful America. In a sense that right now, I think that Joe Biden, who is most obviously being elected the next president, really faces an extremely difficult situation because he, of course, he tries to approach the Trumpist side of the American society, which is reasonable, which is good, and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, he has to also deal with, the more left-oriented people than himself, which probably is not going to be among the most easy tasks because, the American society is polarized to a huge extent right now, and the next president is going to deal with this. So in that sense, we can talk about what Biden administration is going to do in Europe, for example, and hopefully it is going to be what Ms. Pericrest just said, that this case is going to choose a more multilateral approach and deal with international organizations. This is what Trump didn't do. But what is more needed, to my mind, even more needed, is that the American society itself stays stable and democratic. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and the main point is it was heard that these are challenging times, and we will have to face a new challenges that hasn't been approached yet. But it's in our best mind to approach them with the utmost interest and respect to them. And yes, I will go to the first question from the audience right now. The question is addressed to Ms. Slipowitz. It starts with, how should surveillance in order to limit the scope of the pandemic be balanced with respect to privacy and civil liberties? Please, Amy.
Yeah, I think surveillance has been a big concern during the pandemic. I think we can say the public health crisis is laying a foundation for future surveillance states. We have another report, Freedom on the Net, which looks at internet freedom in 65 countries. And we found that authorities have cited COVID-19 to justify expanded surveillance powers and the deployment of new technologies that were once seen as too intrusive. So these include smartphone apps for contact tracing or quarantine compliance with few or no protections against abuse, as well as governments invoking the pandemic to engage in mass surveillance, often directly in partnership with telecommunications providers and other companies. So I think these public health surveillance systems are going to be quite difficult, if not impossible, to decommission. I think it's important to note that many COVID-19 monitoring tools have not been proven to be effective in limiting disease spread, despite their very clear impact on human rights. So at the very least, authorities must prove that a proposed measure is necessary and fit to purpose. If public health experts are able to demonstrate a monitoring program's necessity and effectiveness, it really needs to include independent oversight, transparency, as well as narrowly tailored rules that minimize things like what data is collected, who collects it, and how it can be used. Without such robust safeguards, the marginal benefits of pandemic surveillance are really outweighed by the threat that they pose to democratic values and to human rights.
Yes, thank you. And I would take away a keyword from your answer, the independent oversight, which is becoming much more important for each and everybody of us. All the aspects, media, social interaction, and even our physical interaction, if COVID-19 situation doesn't limit that. But let's go to the next question addressed to Ms. Pericrest. The question states, how is the positive peace concept applicable to finding an optimal response to the COVID-19 pandemic and recovering after it?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fantastic question. So actually earlier this summer, we created a report called COVID-19 and Peace. And we looked at how positive peace paired together with certain economic preconditions allow countries to become more resilient to shocks such as COVID-19. So in that report in particular, we talk about countries that had the economic preconditions paired with high levels of this societal resilience and these strong institutions that are going to allow them to recover quickly. So absolutely look at that report for the specifics there. But I want to also mention that when we're talking about resilience to something like COVID, it's really positive peace is really resilience to many things. So I also recommend to take a look at our ecological threat register, for example, that talks about resilience to environmental catastrophes, for example. All of these things really play into one another. And I think that there's a lot of overlapping elements with democracy as well that we could discuss today. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. The reports made by IYP is really worth looking into them because they're really interesting and brings out the facts that aren't quite visible in, I would say, other reports. Yes, let's go to the next question. This question is addressed to Mr. Ijabs. It states how to minimize sentiment of anti-elitism when groups of society see politicians as privileged in dictating the policy implementation.
Well, first of all, I think that this process is already taking place everywhere, including Europe, in the sense that politicians start to understand that they are not some kind of a separate group with some kind of a privilege, but they are basically just elected to do their job. The problem is how efficient have they been in doing their job. And this is, again, in many European countries, especially in Central Eastern Europe, this is a question of economic growth, but also of social justice. Because what we have seen everywhere during the last 20 years, not just here, but all over the world, is that the socioeconomic inequalities have been raising. And this causes a lot of issues regarding this anti-elitist sentiment, and which leads to certain, populist sentiments and certain sympathies towards these kind of dictators or would-be dictators, or at least anti-elitist politicians like Donald Trump. But, politicians have to be efficient in terms of delivering the real results, which would be, and which would include not just economic growth, but also more equal distribution of this growth, which causes a lot of problems everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you for the answer. Yes, let's go straight to the next answer. Next question. This question is let's just get right into it, because it's not for some specific speaker, but it's for all of you. So I will just read the question, and then maybe I will see your hands. You can raise your hands, and then I will call out the first hand that I see. And the question states, what could be the most lasting threats on democracy after COVID-19 pandemic? What could be the best way to prepare for them now? And I'm looking for the hands, and first hand will be from, it seems like it's from Leah. Go, Miss Pericrest.
Thank you, and thank you for this question. I think what we're seeing a lot of is, as we were actually just discussing about, was having increased socioeconomic inequalities and then therefore exasperating further grievances related to this. We've already seen an uptick in the amount of civil unrest globally, and I think that's only going to continue. What we also see, though, is, and this is part of my question also that I would pose to the other panelists, is that we see an increase in amount of civil unrest during COVID and also over the past decade. For example, if you look at the period from 2011 to 2018, Europe actually had the largest number of protests, riots, and strikes over that period globally. So clearly, this is a trend that's been broiling, and I would say COVID can also push it over the edge a bit. But my question, therefore, my second question, I guess, is when do we consider civil unrest to be a tool and a voice for democracy? And when do we consider civil unrest as a sign of deteriorating democracy? Do we have a line there? I'd be really interested to hear the panelists' perceptions on that. Thanks.
Yes, that's a great question. I believe we could already get to this question. Amy, would you like to start?
Sure, that's a really good question, and I'm not sure I know how to answer it because I think it can be a fine line. I think I would, instead of answering what could be the most lasting effect of COVID on democracy, I want to focus a bit on the positives that could potentially come from this crisis. So one is that I think, as mentioned, we've been seeing a lot of really large protest movements that have emerged during the pandemic. most prominently in Belarus and in some other countries as well. We found that significant protests have taken place in at least 90 countries since the outbreak began, and they were held across all different types of regimes and in every region in the world, which I think really underscores the fact that people will continue to challenge government abuses. And I think that's kind of where that positive side of civil unrest comes in. And then at the same time, there are other openings as well. Despite democratic deterioration, journalism has been able to persist in some countries. Reporters are really risking their safety to report on the pandemic and government abuses associated with it, even in the most repressive of countries. And at the same time, I think the judicial system can also be a positive. There have been some positive court rulings that have kind of rolled back more restrictive pandemic response. So I realize I'm not directly answering your question, but it did prompt me to think of some of the positives that have come from this.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Ijabs, would you like to continue?
Yes, well, all of these questions are so extremely interesting, so I just can't choose to answer. So, well, the first one is the question about the most obvious dangers to democracy apart from the COVID crisis. Well, I completely agree with what was said before about the social inequalities. Nevertheless, the technological change poses a lot of issues for the democratic development, as at least as what concerns democracy as we know it. Of course, the whole story about the Cambridge Analytica and all the possible manipulation with the public opinion by means of very targeted information and very targeted news and so on and so forth. This is still very much on the table and it hasn't disappeared. Also, the polarization of society because of different kinds of bubbles being created in the social media and so on and so forth. So the technological change, I'm not kind of, anti-technology guy because, I'm working on the technology committee of the European Parliament and so on and so forth, which means that I'm an optimist. But nevertheless, I think that the technological change we are going to face in the next, let's say 10 to 20 years is basically immense with artificial intelligence, with 5G and so on and so forth. And it will affect democracy in very diverse ways. As for the second question, the civil unrest in the world, yes, I mean, the very question is extremely important because we in the West, especially, when we are watching the TV, there is this perception that all civil unrest is somehow inherently democratic. This is, by the way, what Henry Kissinger used to write about, who is probably, never mind. If we see some kind of an unrest taking place in the West, we are always sympathizing with those people. And this approach should be questioned because we know that the civil unrest doesn't mean anything in itself. It has a certain political program and a certain political approach. Of course, from the point of view of political theory, you might still ask the question about the division, civil unrest in liberal democracies, which takes place everywhere. And then it has to fulfill certain criteria, like being peaceful, like being open and democratic, and so to being loyal to the constitution and so on and so forth, which is reasonable because we still think that democratic constitutions and liberal democracy in itself is the best available political form we can have. But when we are talking about civil unrest in countries like Belarus, this is something very much different because, these people are really fighting an undemocratic, repressive extremely strong and violent political regime. And at the same time, of course, well, the principle we should refer to is, of course, this old principle of, well, popular sovereignty, because, well, these people have the right to rule over themselves without having this kind of a, well, violent dictator. So in that sense, well, there are nuances, and the very fact that this question is being raised is very important. Thank you.
Thank you on your answers. I see Ms. Percrest, you have your hand raised.
Yes, thank you so much to the other panelists for attempting to take a stab at this very complicated question that I've been thinking a lot about over the past year. So thank you for sharing your insights. I also just wanted to add in two other comments on the question that came from the audience about threats to democracy. Maybe not necessarily threats to democracy, but threats to global peacefulness post-COVID. We've talked a lot about what countries are doing domestically and domestic situations, but also when we're talking on the international level, I think COVID has brought out a lot of international tensions between countries. We've seen a lot of conversations about vaccine nationalism, for example, US and China. These kinds of things are also all shifting due to COVID. In addition to this, we expect to see a drop in aid, which I know was mentioned previously, but when you have, we have fantastic, I think, overseas development aid programs specifically coming from Europe. If these are to decrease in the future, there's a lot of other countries in the globe that depend on this aid to really hold up their institutions. And there's also even down to humanitarian crises that are really going to suffer after COVID should our economics switch to more domestic foci rather than having overseas development aid flourish during this time. So thanks.
Yes, thank you. And I see as the time is slowly running out, this will be the last question that we will be taking on today. It's addressed to Mr. Ijabs, but Ms. Percrest and Ms. Lipowitz, feel free to chime in and raise your hand and I will give you the word. The question is, does liberalism have a monopoly over civil rights and equality? Does security always entail sacrificing liberties?
Well, the first one was about the liberalism have a monopoly over
rights and equality.
No, of course not. Well, because rights and equality, civil equality, are the basic principles of modern European politics and modern Western politics, which don't belong to anyone. As for liberalism, liberalism is basically at the basis of all the other modern ideologies like socialism, conservatism, anarchism, and so on and so forth, because it sets out the scene, which is mainly dealing with the value of an individual, with a value of individual choice and individual freedom. And but nevertheless, well, we can talk much about relations between liberalism and democracy, and these principles are not always very well compatible, because should we have, let's say, a democratic right to cancel someone's human rights? Of course not. But it means that, well, these principles should be somehow made compatible. Well, we can talk about that very much because, well, this is one of my fields of study, the political theory. But nevertheless, of course not. But the liberalism is at the basis of modern politics, of course, in a very broad sense. Thank you.
Yes, and I will repeat the second part of the question, which was, does security always entail sacrificing liberties?
No. Security, but nevertheless, politics involves a certain kind of a trade-off. because, the state can be seen as an instrument which secures your civil and human rights, at the same time limiting your freedom in a sense that, the state can demand your obedience. But again, just like in the previous questions, this is always the question of balance and the question of how these broad principles work in real political institutions in a particular country, in a particular democratic setup. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for answering that. I also wanted to chime in a little bit on this topic concerning the, as it was already mentioned, the democracy and security are not the opposites, and we should look upon and comment and think about that. And as the same as civil rights doesn't come hand in hand with liberalism, there are many more options, and we should to completely understand the concept of liberalism, concept of democracy, and concept of civil rights. We need to think about them individually and understand that they are individual entities. And Ms. Perecrest and Ms. Lipowitz, do you want to comment on this questions and or this topic? And if there aren't any comments from your side, it's perfectly fine. This question was addressed to Mr. Ijabs. Then I will follow up with the main takeaways of this discussion. Is basically it's with new challenges we have to find new solutions, and thanks to such professionals as our speakers, Mr. Ijabs, Ms. Perecrest, and Ms. Lipowitz, we are able to follow these the solution development on daily basis. And for our viewers, the future leaders, we should look upon such tasks as a part of a necessity, to effective and positive development of our environment, of our democracy. And thank you for finding your time, speakers and participants, and thank you, speakers, for joining in and sharing your wisdom and sharing your opinion on the topic of democracy and sustainability. And I hope next year we will be able to come together and continue such topics and continue maybe unanswered questions in such style, but in person in Riga Conference 2021. Thank you.